January 16, 1980, began like countless other winter days in Denver, Colorado. The cold had settled in early that year, the kind that lingered even under daylight, biting through coats and gloves. For Helene Brzezinski, the cold was an inconvenience, not a warning. At 21 years old, she had too much on her mind to think about danger. She was focused on work, on learning, on proving to herself that leaving home had been the right decision. Helen was a journalism student from Hamilton, Massachusetts, the youngest child of Chester and Henrietta Brzezinski. She had grown up in a close-knit family, surrounded by music, school activities, and big dreams. Her older brother Chester, Chet Brzezinski, and her sister Janet Brzezinski Johnson had watched her grow into someone curious, warm, and determined. Journalism wasn't a passing interest for Helen. It was the future she believed in. That belief had brought her nearly 2,000 miles from home to Denver, where she had landed an internship at KHOW Radio, a respected AM news station downtown. For Helen, it was a breakthrough moment. She was only a few weeks into the internship, still learning the rhythms of a newsroom, still trying to absorb everything around her. Colleagues remembered her as bright, enthusiastic, and serious about the work. She asked questions. She listened. She stayed late when she could. That Wednesday, Helen reported to work as usual. She handled her assignments, assisted reporters, and took notes with the quiet focus of someone who knew this opportunity mattered. Earlier in the week, she had even helped cover a story involving the killing of a Secret Service agent, a heavy assignment for a young intern, but one she handled well. The praise she received only strengthened her confidence. As the workday ended, Helen gathered her things and prepared to head home. She was staying in Englewood, a suburb south of Denver, living with relatives while completing her internship. Her routine was simple and familiar. She walked to the bus, rode it back toward Englewood, got off near South Broadway and Union Avenue, and then walked a few short blocks to the house. She had done it many times before. Nothing about it felt risky. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Helen left the KHOW building and boarded the bus. Other passengers came and went. The ride itself was unremarkable, quiet in the way commuter trips often are. Outside, the sky was already darkening, the winter sun fading fast. When the bus reached her stop in Englewood, Helen stood, exited, and stepped onto the sidewalk. That moment, stepping off the bus, would become the last confirmed sighting of Helene Brzezinski alive. She began the short walk home. The distance was not far, just a few blocks, a path she knew well. There were houses nearby, quiet streets, and open areas stretching out toward less developed land. It was cold, but not unbearable. She had no reason to believe anything was wrong. At the house, people were waiting for her. As the minutes passed, no one worried at first. Buses ran late sometimes. Helen could be delayed. She might have stopped somewhere briefly. Time moved on. The clock edged closer to evening. By 9 p.m., concern began to creep in. Helen was reliable, punctual. She called if plans changed. When she still hadn't arrived by 10 p.m., the mood shifted from mild concern to unease. Those waiting for her went outside, scanning the street, looking for her figure in the distance. Nothing. They drove to the bus stop. It was empty, cold, silent. Phone calls were made, first to friends, then to Helen's workplace. KHOW radio confirmed that she had left the building earlier that evening. Bus drivers were contacted. None recalled anything unusual. No one remembered Helen specifically. By now, the fear was unmistakable. Helen's family in Massachusetts had not yet been told. Those with her hesitated, hoping they could resolve the situation before causing panic hundreds of miles away. But as midnight approached, hope thinned. Finally, the call was made. Chester and Henrietta Brzezinski were awakened in their home to hear words no parent is ever prepared for. Their daughter was missing. The night stretched on endlessly. Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside felt important. Every passing car sparked brief hope. Police were contacted. A missing persons report was filed. Officers began asking questions, gathering information, noting timelines. At that point, Helen was still officially missing, not dead. There was still a chance, however fragile, that she would be found alive. But as the hours passed, that chance felt smaller. The next morning, January 17, 1980, dawn arrived cold and gray. Police expanded their search. They retraced Helen's route from the bus stop toward the house. They checked nearby streets, vacant areas, and open land. Officers understood something was wrong. Adults do not simply vanish mid-walk without explanation. Shortly before noon, the call came in. A passerby traveling along Daniels Park Road, near a remote field in Douglas County, had noticed something disturbing in the frozen landscape. From a distance, it didn't look right. When authorities arrived and investigated, the truth became devastatingly clear. A young woman's body had been found. Police secured the scene immediately. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The victim was Helene Brzezinski. Her hands were bound behind her back, She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds were brutal, deliberate, and fatal. By early afternoon, officers returned to the Englewood home where Helen had been staying. The news they delivered shattered whatever hope remained. Chester and Helene Brzezinski, who had already traveled toward Colorado, arrived to a reality no parent should ever face. Their youngest child was gone. Word spread quickly through Englewood, through Denver, and back to Massachusetts. At Hamilton-Wenham Regional High School, where Helen had once sung in choir and performed in school productions, shock rippled through classrooms and hallways. Teachers spoke of her kindness. Friends struggled to understand how a life so full of promise could end so violently. For investigators, the case shifted instantly from missing person to homicide. The questions multiplied. Who had seen her? Who knew her routine? Who could have intercepted her during that short walk home? What had started as an ordinary January evening had transformed, in less than 24 hours, into a nightmare that would define decades to come. And as detectives began combing through evidence and possibilities, one unsettling truth settled in. Someone had taken Helene Brzezinski from the street that night. And for now, that person had disappeared just as completely as she had. By the time law enforcement secured the field near Daniels Park Road, there was no confusion about what they were dealing with. This was not a disappearance that ended peacefully. This was a homicide scene, and from the first moments, it was clear that Helene Brzezinski had been subjected to deliberate, sustained violence. The location itself raised immediate questions. The field sat just off the roadway, isolated enough to avoid attention but close enough that someone familiar with the area could reach it quickly. Investigators from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, along with officers from the Englewood Police Department, established a perimeter and began documenting every detail. The winter cold had frozen the ground, locking evidence in place. Footprints were visible. Tire impressions cut through the frost. The stillness of the scene was unsettling, broken only by the quiet movements of investigators doing their work. Helen's body lay where she had been left. Her wrists were bound behind her back with nylon restraints. She was partially unclothed. The medical examiner, Douglas County Coroner John Andrews, would later confirm what detectives already suspected. Helen had been sexually assaulted. She had suffered multiple stab wounds, most of them to her back, severe enough to puncture her lungs. The injuries told a story of control, intent, and brutality. This was not a spontaneous act. It was planned. Evidence collection began immediately. Investigators photographed the scene from every angle, careful not to disturb what little the field revealed. Plaster casts were made of footprints and tire tracks. Small items nearby, an empty milk carton, bits of debris were collected and bagged, not because they clearly belonged to the killer, but because experience had taught detectives never to dismiss anything. Biological evidence was carefully preserved, including hair and semen samples recovered from Helen's clothing. In 1980, the full value of this evidence could not yet be realized, but officers understood its importance. They treated it as something that might one day speak. As the investigation unfolded, officers worked backward. The most critical question was simple but haunting. How had Helen been taken? Her route from the bus stop near South Broadway and Union Avenue to the Englewood home was short, only a few blocks. Someone would have had to act quickly. Either they knew her routine, or they seized a moment when no one was watching. Police canvassed the area aggressively. Neighbors were interviewed, drivers were stopped, bus passengers were questioned. Officers spoke to anyone who might have been nearby that evening. But the night had been quiet. No one reported screams. No one saw a struggle. That absence of witnesses only reinforced a troubling conclusion. Whoever took Helen knew what they were doing. When news reached the Brzezinski family, the impact was immediate and devastating. Chester and Helene Brzezinski arrived in Colorado shortly after learning their daughter's body had been found. Friends and relatives gathered at the Englewood house, unsure how to offer comfort in the face of something so final. A priest accompanied officers when they delivered the confirmation. For Janet Johnson, Helen's sister, the memory of that moment would never fade. The shock, the disbelief, the sound of her mother's grief filling the room. Back in Hamilton, Massachusetts, the town reacted with disbelief. Violent crime was rare. A young woman from their community, known for her kindness and talent, had been murdered hundreds of miles away. Teachers at Hamilton-Wenham Regional High School described Helen as warm, bright, and joyful. Friends remembered her love of music, her laugh, her certainty that she would one day make a difference as a journalist. As the days passed, pressure mounted on investigators. The media began asking questions. Community fear grew. Parents worried about their daughters. Women questioned routines they had once considered safe. The idea that someone could abduct and murder a young woman so quickly, so quietly, shook the sense of normalcy in Englewood and beyond. Detectives examined Helene's life carefully. They looked at her internship at KHOW Radio, interviewing coworkers, supervisors, and fellow interns. Mike Anthony, the station's news director, spoke highly of her work ethic and professionalism. Nothing about Helene's behavior suggested risk-taking or secret relationships. There was no indication she had met someone voluntarily that night. Everything pointed back to the same conclusion. She had been targeted. One witness account offered a fragile lead. A woman reported seeing a man along Daniels Park Road around 10:20 p.m. on the night Helene disappeared. She described him as a Caucasian male, approximately 20 to 30 years old, with medium-length brown hair and possibly a mustache. Later, under hypnosis, she recalled additional details. It wasn't much, but it was more than investigators had before. Using her description, police worked with a sketch artist to create a composite image of the potential suspect. The sketch was released publicly, shared across news outlets, and posted in police stations. People studied it closely, searching their memories for recognition. Calls came in, tips followed. Each one was documented, each one investigated. Meanwhile, forensic analysis moved slowly. DNA testing as we know it today did not exist. Biological samples were stored, but investigators could do little with them beyond preservation. Hair comparisons and blood typing offered limited information. There was no database to search, no technology capable of delivering a definitive answer. Detectives relied instead on traditional police work, interviews, timelines, criminal histories. Suspects emerged, some had violent pasts, some lived nearby, others simply fit parts of the profile. Each was questioned, scrutinized, and eventually eliminated. Alibis held, evidence failed to connect. One suspect, Kenneth B. Tollerton, a known violent offender, drew particular attention years later due to his history of sexual assaults and murders in Colorado. For a time, investigators believed he might be responsible. But despite strong suspicions, evidence could not place him at the scene of Helene's murder. Once again, the case stalled. As weeks turned into months, the urgency faded publicly but not internally. Detectives revisited the field, re-examined evidence, replayed timelines. They believed the answers were there, just out of reach. But without new information or advancing technology, the investigation slowed. By the end of that first year, the reality set in. Helene Brzezinski's murder had not been solved. The case remained open, but momentum was gone. The suspect was still unknown. The person responsible had vanished back into the world, leaving behind a family devastated by loss and a community haunted by unanswered questions. And as the case slipped quietly into the growing archive of unsolved homicides, one truth became painfully clear. Whoever killed Helene Brzezinski had not been stopped. Not yet. In the weeks following Helene Brzezinski's murder, the investigation entered its most aggressive phase. Detectives from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, assisted by the Englewood Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, worked under intense pressure. A young woman had been abducted from a public bus stop and murdered with extraordinary violence. The community wanted answers, and law enforcement knew the clock was already working against them. Every possible angle was explored. Officers canvassed neighborhoods repeatedly, not just once but several times, hoping someone might remember a detail they had initially dismissed. They questioned residents who lived along Helene's walking route, asking if anyone had noticed a vehicle parked out of place, an unfamiliar face, or unusual activity that night. Most people wanted to help, most had nothing concrete to offer. Detectives turned their attention to South Broadway and Union Avenue, the last confirmed location where Helene was seen alive. Bus drivers were interviewed again. Passenger lists were reviewed where possible. Police attempted to reconstruct the exact timing of Helene stepping off the bus, calculating how many minutes it would have taken for someone to approach her, threaten her, and force her into a vehicle without being seen. The lack of witnesses remained one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Helene vanished in a matter of minutes. No screams were reported. No struggle was observed. Investigators concluded that whoever took her acted decisively and confidently. This was not someone panicking. This was someone in control. The composite sketch became the center of the investigation. Based on the late-night sighting near Daniels Park Road, the image depicted a Caucasian male with medium-length dark hair and a mustache. When it was released, phones began ringing. Tips poured in from across Colorado and even from other states. Some callers were convinced the sketch resembled someone they knew. Others were less certain but felt compelled to report their suspicions anyway. Detectives followed every lead. Men were interviewed at their homes, at workplaces, in police stations. Some cooperated fully. Others bristled under questioning. Alibis were checked, verified, and re-verified. Investigators ran background checks, looking for histories of violence, sexual assault, or similar crimes. Several individuals initially appeared promising but ultimately failed to match the evidence. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the absence of forensic certainty. Semen samples collected from Helene's clothing were preserved, but DNA profiling was not yet possible. Hair and fiber analysis could only narrow possibilities, not confirm identities. Investigators knew they were holding critical evidence, but the tools to unlock its full potential simply did not exist. As the months passed, certain names began circulating more frequently within investigative circles. One of them was Kenneth B. Tollerton, a man later known for a series of violent crimes against women in Colorado. Tollerton had a disturbing history that included rape and murder. At one point, authorities believed he might be responsible for multiple unsolved attacks in the Denver metropolitan area. Tollerton's name resurfaced repeatedly over the years. He had abducted women at gunpoint. He had stalked victims. His crimes bore unsettling similarities to Helene's murder. When Tollerton was later convicted of killing Donna Wolfe, a bartender in Englewood, and the murder of Pamela Foster, a 14-year-old girl found stabbed in a remote area, investigators revisited Helene's case with renewed intensity. For a time, Tollerton seemed like the answer. Detectives compared timelines, locations, and methods. They scrutinized his movements in January 1980. They reviewed witness statements. They examined any possible physical evidence that could connect him to Helene's murder. Despite their efforts, the connection could not be proven. There was no forensic match. No reliable witness placed him at the scene. As much as investigators suspected him, suspicion was not enough. Reluctantly, Tollerton was ruled out. Other suspects followed a similar pattern: men with criminal histories, men who lived nearby, men who matched parts of the composite sketch. Each time, investigators felt a surge of hope, followed by the same crushing disappointment. The evidence never lined up cleanly. Alibis held, timelines didn't fit. The case remained stubbornly unresolved. Behind the scenes, frustration grew. Detectives reviewed the same files repeatedly, convinced that something had been missed. They debated theories late into the night. Was Helene targeted specifically, or was she a victim of opportunity? Did the killer live nearby, or was he passing through? Did he know the area well enough to choose Daniels Park Road deliberately? The brutality of the crime suggested experience. This was not a first-time offender acting on impulse. The use of restraints, the transportation of the victim, the isolated location, all of it pointed towards someone who had done something like this before, or someone who would again. As time passed, public attention waned. Media coverage slowed. New crimes replaced Helene's story in headlines. The community's initial fear gradually softened into uneasy memory. But for Chester and Henrietta Brzezinski, for Janet Johnson, and for those who had loved Helene, time did nothing to dull the pain. Investigators continued working the case, but the energy of the early months was gone. Leads became infrequent, tips dried up, detectives were reassigned, new cases demanded immediate attention. Helene's file remained open, but it began to gather dust. In 1998, nearly 18 years after the murder, authorities made another attempt to revive the investigation. Advances in forensic science allowed the preserved biological evidence to be re-examined and uploaded into the FBI's National DNA Database. For the first time, there was hope that technology might deliver what traditional policing could not. The result was devastating in its simplicity. No match. The DNA profile did not correspond to anyone in the system. The database grew over time, but years passed without a hit. Each update brought brief hope, followed by silence. The case slipped once more into cold storage. Friends of Helene refused to let that be the end. In 2006, several of her high school classmates traveled from Massachusetts to Colorado. They stood at the bus stop. They walked her route. They met with investigators. They asked the same question her family had been asking for decades. How could someone do this and never be caught? Their determination reignited brief attention, but without new evidence, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. Law enforcement had done everything they could with the tools available to them. The truth was painfully clear. The case was frozen in time. For years, Helene Brzezinski's murder existed in a kind of limbo, not solved, not forgotten. A name in a file, a photograph on a wall, a reminder of a failure that haunted those who had tried to prevent it. And yet, buried deep in an evidence locker, preserved with care decades earlier, the answer still waited. Science had not yet found its voice, but when it did, it would reach back across 40 years and finally force the truth into the light. Every case on this channel is more than just a story. It takes days of research, fact-checking, and piecing together real lives that were lost. We do this because these stories matter, and because someone still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind cases like this, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which part of today's case affected you the most. Your support is what keeps this work going. And if you'd like to watch more solved cold cases, you'll find the links waiting in the description below. Now let's get back to the case. As the investigation stalled, life moved forward for everyone except the people who mattered most. For Helene Brzezinski's family, time did not heal, it calcified. The unanswered questions became part of their daily existence, shaping how they slept, how they spoke to one another, and how they imagined the world outside their home. Chester and Henrietta Brzezinski returned to Hamilton, Massachusetts, carrying grief they had no way to set down. They were parents who had done everything right by their youngest child. They had raised her with care, encouraged her ambition, celebrated her courage when she chose to leave home for an internship nearly 2,000 miles away. And now that decision echoed through their lives with a weight neither of them could escape. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. Chester, once outgoing and protective, withdrew. He rarely spoke about Helen, but those close to him understood the guilt he carried. He questioned himself endlessly. Should he have asked her to stay closer to home? Should he have insisted she live somewhere else? Could he have protected her from a danger he never imagined? These questions had no answers, but they haunted him until the day he died. Henrietta bore her grief differently. She spoke Helen's name often. She kept her daughter alive through memory, through photographs, through stories told and retold. At night, she wondered what Helen might have become: a journalist, a broadcaster, a woman with a family of her own. Each imagined future ended the same way, abruptly, in the frozen field in Colorado where her life had been taken. For Janet Johnson, Helen's older sister, the loss was both personal and isolating. She had been 9 years older than Helen, old enough to feel protective, old enough to remember their childhood clearly. Janet replayed those memories constantly. Helen's laughter, her warmth, her certainty that the world was something she could understand and change. After the murder, Janet found herself lying awake at night, worrying not only about her sister, but about her parents. She feared the grief would destroy them. She feared what silence was doing to her family. And she feared that the man who had killed Helen was still out there, living freely, while her family was serving a life sentence of loss. The years passed without answers. Holidays came and went. Birthdays were acknowledged quietly. Helen's absence became most visible in the moments meant for celebration. There was always an empty space, always a sense that something essential was missing. When Helen's brother, Chester Chet Brzezinski, retreated inward, the family worried but didn't know how to reach him. He carried his pain privately, rarely speaking about Helen, rarely sharing his thoughts. When he passed away in 2009, Janet felt the loss compound. Another piece of the family gone without ever knowing the truth. By 2012, both Chester and Henrietta Brzezinski had died. They never learned who murdered their daughter. They never heard a confession, never saw an arrest, never received the closure they had waited decades for. When they passed, Helen's case passed into a new and painful phase. There was now only one immediate family member left to carry her memory. Janet was alone, yet Helen was not forgotten. In Massachusetts, former classmates and friends refused to let her name disappear. They remembered her as more than a victim. She was the girl who sang in choir, the student who loved baseball, the friend who listened without judgment. Over the years, they spoke about her to their children, keeping her story alive for people who had never met her. In 2006, more than 25 years after Helen's murder, several of her high school friends made a decision. They traveled to Englewood, Colorado, retracing Helen's final steps. They stood at the bus stop near South Broadway and Union Avenue, imagining the last moments of her ordinary day. They walked the short route she never finished. They stood near Daniels Park Road, trying to reconcile the peaceful landscape with the violence that had occurred there. Their visit was not about answers. It was about refusal. Refusal to accept that Helen's life could be reduced to an unsolved file. Refusal to let time erase accountability. They met with investigators, asked questions, and reminded law enforcement that someone was still waiting. Janet followed every development from afar. Each time the case was reopened, hope flared briefly, then faded. In 1998, when DNA evidence was re-examined and uploaded to a national database, she allowed herself to believe that science might finally succeed where traditional investigation had failed. When no match came, the disappointment was crushing. Years later, as technology advanced again, the case was reviewed once more. Each review followed the same pattern: optimism, silence, waiting. Janet learned to live with uncertainty, but she never accepted it. She read articles, answered calls from journalists, gave interviews when asked. She wanted the world to remember Helen as a person, not just a crime. As time stretched on, Helen's case became a quiet presence in the background of Colorado's criminal history. Investigators knew it well. Younger detectives learned it as a cautionary example of how limited technology once was. It became a reminder that some answers were simply ahead of their time. But the evidence remained. Biological samples carefully preserved in 1980 sat untouched by modern analysis. They waited in storage, silent and patient. No one could have known then that decades later, those samples would speak louder than any witness ever could. For Janet, the waiting became a way of life. She measured time not in years, but in anniversaries. Another year since Helene stepped off that bus. Another year without justice. Another year of wondering if the man responsible had lived a full life while her sister had been denied one. By the time Janet reached her late 60s, she had spent more than half her life carrying this weight. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever know the truth. Moments when she feared she would die like her parents, never hearing a name, never seeing accountability. And yet, somewhere within the system, a shift was beginning. Investigators in Douglas County, armed with tools unimaginable in 1980, were preparing to reopen the case in a way it had never been reopened before. They were no longer looking for eyewitnesses or confessions. They were looking for family trees, genetic connections, invisible threads that linked the past to the present. For decades, Helene Brzezinski's case had been frozen in time, suspended between grief and hope. But now, quietly and without fanfare, science was catching up. And for the first time in 40 years, the truth was no longer just a possibility. It was approaching. Nearly 4 decades after Helene Brzezinski was murdered, her case was no longer being driven by urgency or public pressure. It was being driven by something quieter, more methodical, and far more dangerous to the man who had gotten away with it for so long. Science had finally caught up. By 2017, cold case investigators within the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, working alongside the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, made a decision that would change everything. Instead of asking who might remember something from 1980, they asked a different question. What if the answer had been sitting in evidence storage all along, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist? The biological evidence collected from Helene's body had been preserved with care. At the time of her murder, detectives could not have imagined what DNA would become. In 1980, they could only store it. In 1999, they could only compare it against a limited criminal database. But now, forensic genealogy offered something radically different. It didn't look for the suspect directly. It looked for his relatives. Investigators re-examined the semen sample recovered from Helene's clothing. Using modern techniques, analysts were able to develop a more complete DNA profile. Not enough to identify a person outright, but enough to begin building a genetic map. This profile was uploaded, not into law enforcement databases, but into publicly accessible genealogy platforms like GEDmatch, where everyday people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA in hopes of learning about their ancestry. This was the moment the case shifted from cold to active. Within weeks, the DNA profile returned partial matches, distant relatives, second and third cousins, people who had no idea their curiosity about family history would connect them to a 40-year-old murder. Investigators worked carefully, respecting legal boundaries but relentlessly building a family tree branch by branch. Names began to appear. One genetic line stood out, a woman who had lived under multiple surnames over the course of her life. Her children had been scattered, some raised by relatives, some moving between states. The family history was fractured, unstable. Exactly the kind of background that made someone hard to track. From that tree, detectives narrowed their focus to 2 brothers. One of them immediately drew attention. His birth name was Curtis Allen White. Records showed that Curtis Allen White had a violent criminal history. In 1975, he had been convicted of first-degree rape in Arkansas after entering a woman's home under the pretense of using her phone and assaulting her at knife point. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and yet, shockingly, he served only 4. In March 1979, Curtis Allen White was paroled. More importantly, parole records showed he was allowed to relocate to Colorado, where he lived under the supervision of a former counselor. The location placed him in Douglas County, within miles of where Helene Brzezinski would be abducted and murdered less than a year later. The timeline fit, the geography fit, and when investigators compared his old photographs to the composite sketch from 1980, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. At some point after Helene's murder, Curtis Allen White disappeared from records under that name. Investigators discovered he had legally changed his identity in Florida, becoming James Curtis Clanton. Under his new name, he lived quietly. He married, divorced, worked various jobs. Eventually, he became a truck driver. For decades, he blended in. By 2019, James Curtis Clanton was living in Lake Butler, Florida, completely unaware that his DNA had already begun to close in on him. Investigators did not rush. They couldn't afford to. A single mistake could compromise the entire case. Instead, they watched. Surveillance teams quietly followed Clanton's routine. They learned where he worked, where he ate, where he drank. They waited for the moment science needed a clean, discarded DNA sample that could be legally obtained and unquestionably linked to him. The first attempt failed. Investigators recovered a discarded milk carton believed to belong to Clanton. Testing produced no usable DNA. For a moment, it felt like the case might slip away again, just as it had so many times before. But they didn't stop. Days later, Clanton visited a local bar. He ordered a drink. He left behind something ordinary, something forgettable, a beer mug. When investigators retrieved it and sent it for testing, the wait felt endless. This was the moment everything hinged on. 40 years of grief, decades of unanswered questions, one piece of glass. The results came back quietly without ceremony. The DNA on the beer mug matched the DNA recovered from Helene Brzezinski's body. There was no ambiguity, no margin for error. The probability was overwhelming. The science that didn't exist in 1980 had finally spoken. Investigators moved quickly. On December 11, 2019, James Curtis Clanton, age 62, was taken into custody in Florida. He was arrested without incident. To the outside world, he was just another man being detained. To those who had worked the case, this was the end of a 40-year pursuit. But an arrest was only the beginning. Clanton denied involvement at first. He agreed to speak with investigators, believing perhaps that time itself had erased the truth. He didn't yet understand how completely the past had caught up to him. As detectives prepared to extradite him to Colorado, they knew one thing with certainty. They were no longer chasing a ghost. They were sitting across from him. And once he started talking, the silence that had surrounded Helene Brzezinski's murder for 4 decades was about to break. The arrest of James Curtis Clanton marked the end of a search that had lasted nearly 40 years, but it did not yet bring peace. For investigators, for Janet Johnson, and for everyone who had carried Helene Brzezinski's name through decades of silence, the truth still had to be spoken aloud. Clanton was extradited from Florida to Colorado under heavy guard. During the transport, investigators gave him opportunities to talk, but they did not press. They had learned long ago that pressure often produced denial, not truth. They already had what they needed. The DNA had closed the door behind him. Time finally was not on his side. At first, Clanton maintained distance. He answered questions carefully. He acknowledged living in Colorado in 1980. He acknowledged working landscaping jobs. He acknowledged taking buses, driving the roads near Englewood. Each answer landed exactly where investigators expected it to. He was walking toward the truth without yet admitting it. Then something shifted. During questioning, Clanton began to speak differently. His words slowed. The rehearsed tone faded. When shown Helene's photograph, he did not react with confusion or anger. He recognized her. That recognition was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Eventually, the confession came. Clanton admitted that on January 16, 1980, he had been near the bus stop on South Broadway near Union Avenue. He admitted approaching Helen after she stepped off the bus. He admitted showing her a knife. He admitted forcing her into his car. There was no dramatic outburst, no attempt to minimize what followed. He spoke in flat, chilling detail. He told investigators he drove her to the area near Daniels Park Road. He admitted binding her hands behind her back. He admitted sexually assaulting her. He admitted stabbing her repeatedly, mostly in the back, before leaving her in the field. He acknowledged that she asked him not to hurt her. He acknowledged that she remained calm, compliant, hoping he would let her go. He never did. For detectives who had spent years studying the case, the confession confirmed what the evidence had already revealed. This was not a random act of panic. It was deliberate. It was controlled. And it had been carried out by a man who had already shown the world exactly who he was long before Helen ever stepped off that bus. When James Curtis Clanton was formally charged, the case that had haunted Douglas County for 4 decades finally had a name attached to it. He faced charges of first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. Sexual assault charges could not be filed due to statutes of limitation, a legal technicality that stung deeply but did not change the gravity of what he had done. For Janet Johnson, the news arrived quietly. A phone call. A voice on the other end telling her what she had waited most of her life to hear. They had found him. They knew who killed Helen. Janet listened. She cried. And then, after all those years, she felt something she had almost stopped believing was possible. Validation, the knowledge that her sister's death had not been forgotten, that the system, slow and imperfect as it was, had not given up entirely. In July 2020, Clanton stood in a Colorado courtroom for sentencing. He was 63 years old. Helen would have been 62. The room was filled with people who had carried this case for decades: investigators, prosecutors, victim advocates, and members of the community who remembered Helene not as a headline, but as a person. Janet addressed the court. She spoke of her sister's kindness, her warmth, the way she made people feel seen. She spoke of the decades her family lived without answers, of parents who died without knowing the truth, of a brother who retreated into silence and never came back. She spoke of nights spent wondering whether Helene suffered, whether she was afraid, whether she knew she was loved. And she spoke of the man standing before her. She did not scream. She did not insult him. Her words carried the weight of a lifetime. She told the court that while his arrest brought some peace, there could never be full closure. Helene was gone. No sentence could change that. Clanton said nothing. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years under the laws in place at the time of the crime. It was not the harshest sentence modern law would allow, but it was accountability. It was finality. It was the end of a 40-year lie. As Clanton was led away, the courtroom fell silent. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only the quiet acknowledgement that justice, delayed beyond reason, had finally arrived. Outside the courtroom, Janet carried her sister with her as she always had. But now the burden had shifted. The questions that once haunted her had answers. The man who stole Helene's future no longer walked free. The truth had been named, documented, and spoken into record. In the years since, Helene Brzezinski has been remembered not only as a victim, but as a young woman whose life mattered enough for science, persistence, and human determination to cross 4 decades to find her killer. Her name is spoken in classrooms, in scholarship funds, in quiet conversations about why cold cases must never be abandoned. Because sometimes justice does not arrive quickly. Sometimes it waits. And when it finally does, it reminds us of something essential. No matter how much time passes, the truth does not disappear. It only waits for the moment it can no longer be ignored.